They thought firing me would silence me forever. What they didn't realize was that they had just handed me the motivation to destroy everything they'd built. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and this is the story of how I went from being a harassment victim to owning the company that tried to destroy me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When I first walked through the glass doors of Tech Forward Solutions in downtown Austin 15 years ago, I thought I had found my dream job. The company occupied the entire 12th floor of a sleek high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Texas Hill Country. The office buzzed with energy, filled with young professionals typing furiously on MacBooks, craft beer on tap in the break room, and motivational posters about disrupting the industry, plastered on every wall. I was 29 then, fresh out of my MBA program at UT, carrying student loan debt that felt heavier than the humid Austin summer air. My daughter Sofia was only 7 years old, and I was doing everything alone after her father decided that fatherhood wasn't compatible with his music career dreams. The starting salary wasn't spectacular, but Tech Forward promised growth, equity options, and the chance to build something meaningful in Austin's booming tech scene. Mike Thompson, the CEO and founder, had started the company just a year earlier with nothing but a laptop and an idea to revolutionize how local businesses approached digital marketing. He was 47 then, with the kind of confident smile that made investors write checks, and the easy charm that made employees believe they were part of something special. During my interview, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Emma, we're not just building a company here, we're building a family. And family takes care of family." I believed him completely. Those early years felt like a whirlwind of 18-hour days, late-night strategy sessions, fueled by takeout containers and too much coffee, and the intoxicating rush of watching something grow from nothing. I started as a junior marketing coordinator, but Mike quickly recognized my ability to see patterns in data that others missed. While my colleagues focused on flashy campaigns, I was the one who could predict which clients would renew their contracts 3 months in advance, who understood the subtle psychology behind why certain messaging resonated with Austin's eclectic business community. By my 3rd year, I was managing our largest accounts. By my 5th, I was leading the entire marketing strategy for a company that had grown to 50 employees. Mike made a big show of promoting me to senior marketing director, complete with a company-wide email about how I embodied the tech-forward spirit of innovation and dedication. The salary bump meant I could finally afford to move Sofia and me out of our cramped apartment and into a modest 2-bedroom house in South Austin, complete with a small backyard where she could practice soccer. But success in Austin's tech world came with unspoken rules that took me years to fully understand. The real decisions happened on golf courses I wasn't invited to, at networking events that somehow never made it to my calendar, and during those legendary team-building happy hours that always seemed to exclude the women who had families waiting at home. I learned to navigate these dynamics carefully, proving my worth through results rather than relationships, building my reputation one successful campaign at a time. The company culture revolved around Mike's vision of controlled chaos. He encouraged risk-taking, celebrated bold moves, and had an uncanny ability to make everyone feel like they were part of something revolutionary. The office walls were covered with screenshots of positive client reviews, photos from company retreats in the Hill Country, and inspirational quotes about thinking outside the box. Every Friday afternoon, Mike would gather the entire company in our main conference room, which he'd nicknamed the Bullpen, to celebrate the week's wins and share his vision for where we were headed next. I threw myself into that culture completely. I was the one staying late to perfect presentations, volunteering to handle difficult client calls, and mentoring the stream of eager 20-somethings who joined our team each quarter. When we landed our first $1 million client, a regional retail chain looking to expand their online presence, I was the one who crafted the strategy that exceeded their expectations by 40%. When the city of Austin put out an RFP for their tourism marketing campaign, I spent 3 weeks developing a proposal that ultimately won us a 2-year contract worth 6 figures annually. Sofia grew up understanding that mommy worked at a special place where people respected her expertise and valued her contribution. I would bring her to occasional company picnics, where Mike would make a point of asking about her grades and telling her how proud she should be of her hardworking mother. She would beam with pride when colleagues would mention seeing our latest campaign around town, and I felt like I was setting a powerful example of what women could achieve in the professional world. The first 10 years were everything I had hoped they would be. My equity in the company grew steadily, my 401k balance climbed higher each quarter, and my professional reputation in Austin's business community became solid enough that headhunters would occasionally reach out with opportunities at larger firms, but I always turned them down. Tech Forward wasn't just my employer anymore. It was the place where I had proven myself, where I had built something meaningful, where I had created a stable foundation for my daughter's future. I genuinely loved the work itself. Digital marketing in the 2010s felt like being on the frontier of something completely new every few months. Social media platforms were constantly evolving, customer behavior was shifting in real time, and the tools available for targeting and measurement were becoming more sophisticated each quarter. I prided myself on staying ahead of these trends, often spending weekends reading industry blogs and testing new platforms before our competitors even knew they existed. My colleagues respected my expertise, and clients specifically requested to work with me on their most challenging projects. When a local restaurant chain needed to recover from a social media crisis, they called me. When a startup needed to establish credibility in a crowded market, they wanted my strategic input. When established businesses needed to understand why their traditional marketing approaches weren't working anymore, they turned to my team for answers. The satisfaction of solving complex problems, of seeing a struggling business transform their results through strategies I had developed, made every late night and weekend spent refining campaigns feel worthwhile. I wasn't just earning a paycheck. I was using my skills to help local businesses thrive, to support Austin's entrepreneurial ecosystem, and to prove that smart, data-driven marketing could make a real difference in people's lives. But looking back now, I realize I was so focused on proving my professional worth that I didn't pay enough attention to the subtle ways the environment was changing around me. Mike's family rhetoric remained consistent, but the actual dynamics of who was included in key decisions, who received the most visible opportunities, and who had access to Mike's inner circle, were shifting in ways that would eventually become impossible to ignore. The first sign of trouble came during my 11th year, when Mike hired Tony Russo as our chief financial officer. Tony had worked with Mike at his previous company, and they had the easy familiarity of people who had weathered business challenges together. Tony brought a more aggressive approach to cost management and revenue optimization, which initially seemed like exactly what we needed as competition in the Austin market intensified. But Tony also brought a different philosophy about company culture. He believed that our work hard, play hard environment needed more structure, more accountability, and more focus on what he called performance-driven decision-making. In practice, this meant that promotions and key assignments started going to people who fit a specific mold, people who could seamlessly transition from client meetings to after-work networking events, people who understood the unspoken rules of corporate politics that I had always been too busy delivering results to master. The changes were gradual enough that they felt like natural evolution rather than conscious exclusion. Quarterly planning meetings started happening at restaurants instead of conference rooms. Client entertainment events became more frequent and more elaborate. The company's annual retreat moved from a casual weekend at a hill country resort to a 4-day golf and networking extravaganza that felt designed to showcase relationships rather than celebrate achievement. I adapted as best I could, attending what events I could manage around Sofia's schedule, building relationships with clients through excellent work rather than social connections, and continuing to deliver the results that had always been my calling card. My performance reviews remained stellar, my client satisfaction scores stayed consistently high, and my team's revenue numbers continued to exceed targets quarter after quarter, but I could feel something shifting in the way Mike and Tony discussed strategic decisions. Conversations would pause when I entered rooms, important emails would somehow not make it to my inbox until after decisions had already been made, and my input on major initiatives was increasingly treated as optional rather than essential. The equity options that had once felt like a pathway to real financial security were restructured in ways that favored longer-tenured executives, and my requests for additional team resources were met with budget concerns that never seemed to apply to other departments. Still, I persevered. I had built too much at Tech Forward to walk away over office politics and personality conflicts. Sofia was thriving in high school, my mortgage was manageable, and my professional reputation was strong enough that I felt confident about my long-term prospects. I believed that good work would eventually speak for itself, that results would triumph over politics, and that the company I had helped build would remember the value I had consistently delivered. Then Brad Collins joined the team, and everything changed forever. Mike introduced Brad as his old fraternity brother from UT, who would be taking over as VP of Sales to help us reach the next level of growth. Brad was 38, with the kind of polished confidence that came from never having to prove himself in environments where he wasn't automatically welcome. He had spent the previous decade working for larger firms in Dallas, building what Mike described as exactly the kind of enterprise sales experience we need to compete with the big players. Brad's hiring felt different from other executive additions we had made over the year. There was no search committee, no interview process with multiple candidates, no opportunity for department heads to provide input on what skills and experience would best complement our existing team. Mike simply announced the decision during a Friday afternoon company meeting, presented it as a fait accompli, and made it clear that Brad would have significant autonomy to reshape our sales approach and client relationship. From his first week, Brad operated with a level of authority that seemed disconnected from his actual knowledge of our business model, our client base, or our company culture. He scheduled one-on-one meetings with every female employee under 30, supposedly to understand how sales and marketing could collaborate more effectively. He instituted mandatory happy hours for relationship building that somehow always extended later than most parents could manage. He brought in expensive client entertainment that felt more like fraternity parties than professional networking events. But what bothered me most was the way Brad seemed to view client relationships as personal conquests rather than professional partnerships. He would make comments about female clients' appearances during internal strategy meetings, suggest that certain deals could be closed more easily with the right kind of personal attention, and treat business dinners like opportunities to test boundaries rather than build trust. I tried to address these concerns through proper channels. I scheduled a private meeting with Mike to express. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My discomfort with some of Brad's approaches to client management. I suggested that we needed clearer guidelines around professional conduct during client entertainment events. I recommended additional training on harassment prevention and inclusive workplace practices that could help us maintain the professional environment that had always been one of Tech Forward's strengths. Mike listened politely, thanked me for my input, and assured me that Brad was still adjusting to our company culture. He suggested that I was perhaps being overly sensitive to changes that were simply part of growing into a more sophisticated sales organization. He reminded me that Brad's track record spoke for itself and that we needed to trust his expertise in areas where our company had traditionally been weak. The conversation left me feeling dismissed and confused. The Mike Thompson who had promoted me based on merit, who had celebrated my strategic thinking, who had built a company culture around mutual respect and professional excellence, seemed to have been replaced by someone who prioritized personal relationships over performance, who valued conformity over competence, and who was willing to overlook behavior that made half his workforce uncomfortable in order to avoid difficult conversations with his inner circle. But I was 44 years old, 15 years into building something meaningful at this company, with a daughter who would be starting college in just a few years. Walking away wasn't a realistic option, and I still believed that I could find ways to navigate these new dynamics without compromising my principles or my profession. I had weathered other challenges at Tech Forward, had proven my resilience and adaptability time and again, and had built relationships with clients and colleagues that I hoped would provide some protection against any temporary turbulence in the company's leadership approach. I decided to focus on what I could control, delivering exceptional results for my clients, mentoring the younger employees who looked to me for guidance, and maintaining the professional standards that had always defined my approach to work. I told myself that this was just another challenge to overcome, another opportunity to prove that excellence and integrity could coexist, another chapter in a career story that would ultimately end with the kind of success that would make Sofia proud of everything her mother had accomplished. What I didn't understand during those first few months after Brad's arrival was how quickly a workplace culture can shift when leadership stops enforcing boundaries. It wasn't just about Brad's behavior, though that was certainly problematic enough. It was about the way Mike and Tony seemed to view his conduct as a minor adjustment period, rather than a fundamental threat to the professional environment we had spent years building. The changes started small, almost imperceptible. Brad would interrupt women during client presentations in ways he never did with male colleagues. He would make comments about personal appearance that he framed as compliments, but felt more like evaluation. During team meetings, he had a habit of dismissing ideas from female employees, and then presenting nearly identical suggestions as his own innovations, just minutes later. When called out on these patterns, he would laugh them off as misunderstandings, or suggest that people were being overly sensitive. Janet Kim, our HR manager, started receiving complaints within Brad's second month. Janet had been with the company for 8 years and had always handled personnel issues with professionalism and discretion. She was known for her ability to resolve conflicts before they escalated, and for maintaining the kind of workplace environment where people felt comfortable raising concern. But Brad's behavior was creating a different kind of challenge, one that seemed to require a different response than the typical personality conflicts or communication breakdowns that Janet usually managed. I learned about the complaints because Janet approached me directly, seeking advice on how to handle a situation that felt unprecedented in our company's history. She explained that 3 different women had come to her with concerns about Brad's conduct during client meetings, company events, and one-on-one interaction. The complaints ranged from inappropriate comments about physical appearance to uncomfortable personal questions about relationships and dating history. None of the incidents individually rose to the level of actionable harassment, but together they painted a picture of someone who consistently pushed boundaries and made female employees uncomfortable. Janet's dilemma was that when she had attempted to address these concerns with Mike, he had dismissed them as growing pains from integrating a new leadership style. He suggested that Brad's more casual approach to workplace interactions was actually beneficial for team building, and that the women complaining were perhaps not adapting well to a more dynamic sales environment. Mike had even implied that Janet might be creating problems where none existed, and that she should focus on helping employees adjust to new expectations, rather than micromanaging interpersonal dynamics. The conversation with Janet was the first time I realized how fundamentally the power structure at Tech Forward had shifted. Mike's willingness to dismiss legitimate concerns about professional conduct in favor of protecting Brad revealed priorities that I had never seen before. It wasn't just about friendship or loyalty to an old fraternity brother. It was about a worldview that valued certain kinds of relationships and certain kinds of behavior over the professional standards that had supposedly defined our company culture. I encouraged Janet to document everything carefully and to continue following proper procedures for addressing workplace conduct issues. I also began paying closer attention to the dynamics during company meetings and client interactions, looking for patterns that might help build a more comprehensive case for addressing Brad's behavior through official channels. What I discovered was deeply disturbing. Brad had developed a systematic approach to testing boundaries with female employees and clients, gradually escalating inappropriate behavior to see how much he could get away with before anyone pushed back effectively. With older women or those in senior positions, he would stick to comments about appearance and occasional invasive personal questions. With younger employees, particularly those in entry-level positions, who were financially dependent on their jobs, he became increasingly bold about physical contact, inappropriate invitations, and quid pro quo suggestions about advancement opportunity. The most troubling pattern involved client entertainment events. Brad had instituted a new approach to closing deals that involved elaborate dinners, expensive wine, and after-hours networking that often extended well into the evening. Female employees were expected to attend these events as part of their professional responsibilities, but Brad would use them as opportunities to create situations where normal workplace boundaries didn't apply. He would insist on ordering drinks for everyone, encourage excessive alcohol consumption, and then use the relaxed atmosphere to make comments and suggestions that would be clearly inappropriate in an office setting. I witnessed this behavior firsthand during a client dinner with Austin's largest tourism board, account worth nearly $200,000 annually. The client contact was a woman in her early 30s, who had recently been promoted to marketing director after years of working her way up through the organization. Brad spent the entire evening focusing his attention on her in ways that had nothing to do with our marketing proposal and everything to do with personal attraction. He commented repeatedly on her appearance, asked intrusive questions about her personal life, and insisted on refilling her wine glass every time she took a sip. When she tried to redirect conversations back to business topics, he would dismiss them as boring shop talk and suggest that successful partnerships required getting to know each other as people. The client became visibly uncomfortable as the evening progressed, but Brad seemed oblivious to her discomfort or simply didn't care. The next morning, our client contact called me directly to express concerns about the dinner and to ask whether working with Tech Forward would require her to manage similar situations in the future. I tried to reassure her that the previous evening was not representative of our normal client relationship approach, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. She ultimately decided to continue with our contract, but she specifically requested that all future interactions be handled through me rather than through Brad's sales team. When I reported this feedback to Mike, hoping he would recognize the potential damage Brad's behavior could cause to our client relationships, his response was dismissive and frustrated. He suggested that the client was probably overreacting to Brad's friendly approach and that we shouldn't let one person's sensitivity dictate how we conducted business. He even implied that my concerns about the situation might be influenced by jealousy or territorial feelings about client relationships that had traditionally been managed through marketing rather than sales. That conversation was a turning point in my understanding of how the company leadership viewed these issues. Mike wasn't simply unaware of the problems Brad was creating. He was actively choosing to minimize and dismiss them because addressing them would require acknowledging that his hiring decision had been a mistake and that his friend's behavior was damaging both employee morale and client relationships. The situation escalated significantly during our annual company retreat in the Hill Country. The retreat had always been one of my favorite tech-forward traditions, a chance for the entire team to step away from daily pressures and focus on strategic planning, team building, and celebrating our collective achievement. Previous retreats had been carefully planned to include meaningful professional development, recreational activities that appealed to diverse interests, and social events that brought people together without creating uncomfortable situations for anyone. But Brad's influence had transformed the retreat into something much more focused on alcohol consumption, late-night socializing, and activities that seemed designed to blur the lines between professional and personal relationships. The agenda included mandatory group dinners that extended well into the evening, a pool party that Brad described as clothing optional during the planning meeting, and team-building exercises that involved physical contact and personal disclosure that many employees found inappropriate. I raised concerns about the retreat agenda during the planning phase, suggesting that we needed activities that would be comfortable for all employees, regardless of their personal comfort levels with physical contact or alcohol consumption. My feedback was dismissed as overthinking and trying to create problems where none existed. Tony Russo even suggested that my concerns revealed a lack of team spirit and an unwillingness to adapt to the more dynamic culture that Brad was helping to create. The actual retreat was worse than I had anticipated. Brad used every social interaction as an opportunity to test boundaries, make inappropriate comments, and create situations where female employees felt pressured to participate in activities that made them uncomfortable. The pool party became an excuse for Brad to make comments about women's bodies and to initiate physical contact under the guise of playful water games. The group dinners turned into opportunities for Brad to encourage excessive drinking and to make suggestions about room assignments and after-hours activities that were clearly inappropriate. Several female employees approached me privately during the retreat to express their discomfort with the situation and to ask for advice on how to handle Brad's behavior without jeopardizing their jobs. These conversations were heartbreaking because they revealed how trapped these women felt. They needed their paychecks. They valued their professional relationships at Tech Forward, and they didn't want to be seen as troublemakers or people who couldn't handle a more casual work environment. but they were also being subjected to behavior that made them question their safety and their professional dignity. The breaking point came during the final evening's dinner when Brad made a toast that was ostensibly about team unity but was actually filled with sexual innuendo and inappropriate comments about specific female employees. He talked about getting to know each other better, about breaking down barriers, and about exploring new possibilities together. The subtext was unmistakable, and the discomfort in the room was palpable. When I attempted to redirect the conversation toward more appropriate topics, Brad publicly dismissed my concerns and suggested that I was being a buzzkill who didn't understand the importance of building authentic relationships within the team. Mike laughed along with Brad's comments and made no effort to restore appropriate boundaries or to address the obvious discomfort that many employees were experiencing. That night, I made the decision to document everything I had witnessed and to file a formal complaint about Brad's conduct and Mike's failure to address it appropriately. I spent hours writing a detailed report that outlined specific incidents, identified witnesses, and explained how Brad's behavior was creating a hostile work environment for female employees and potentially damaging our client relationship. I submitted the report to Janet Kim the following Monday morning, along with a request for a formal investigation into Brad's conduct and a review of the company's harassment prevention policy. I also indicated that I was prepared to provide additional documentation and witness statements, if necessary, to ensure that the situation was addressed appropriately. Janet reviewed my report carefully and promised to follow proper procedures for investigating the complaint. But when she attempted to schedule a meeting with Mike to discuss the investigation, she was told that he was too busy with strategic planning to focus on what Tony Russo characterized as personality conflicts and miscommunication. The delay in addressing my formal complaint sent a clear message about how seriously the company leadership was taking these issues. For the first time in my 15 years at Tech Forward, I began to question whether the company I had helped build was still committed to the values that had originally attracted me to work there. The retaliation began almost immediately. Within a week of submitting my complaint, I noticed that my access to certain client communications had been restricted. Meetings were being scheduled without my participation, decisions were being made without my input, and my team members were being reassigned to other projects without explanation. When I asked Mike about these changes, he explained them as part of a strategic reorganization designed to optimize our operational efficiency. But the pattern was too obvious to ignore. Every change seemed designed to isolate me from key decision-making processes and to diminish my influence within the organization. Brad, meanwhile, was being given increasing authority over client relationships and strategic planning, despite the fact that several clients had specifically requested to work with other team members after uncomfortable interactions with him. The message was becoming clear: employees who challenged Brad's behavior or questioned the new cultural direction would find their professional opportunities limited and their job security threatened. The company that had once prided itself on merit-based advancement and professional excellence was now operating according to different rules that prioritized loyalty to leadership over performance and that treated complaints about inappropriate conduct as acts of disloyalty rather than legitimate workplace concerns. I realized that I was facing a choice between accepting this new reality and continuing to fight for the professional standards that I believed were essential for maintaining both employee dignity and client trust. The decision I made would determine not only my own future at Tech Forward, but also whether other women in the organization would have any protection against increasingly inappropriate behavior from leadership. As spring turned to summer in Austin, the situation reached a crisis point. Brad's behavior had become increasingly brazen, and the company's refusal to address legitimate complaints had created an environment where other male employees began to adopt similar approaches to workplace interactions. What had started as one person's inappropriate conduct was becoming a systemic problem that threatened the professional dignity of every woman in the organization. The incident that finally forced a confrontation happened during a client presentation for a major technology startup looking to launch their first consumer marketing campaign. The contract was worth over $300,000 and represented exactly the kind of high-value, high-visibility work that could establish Tech Forward as a serious player in Austin's competitive marketing landscape. I had spent weeks developing a comprehensive strategy that addressed the client's unique challenges and leveraged our team's expertise in both traditional and digital marketing approaches. The presentation was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in our main conference room, with the client's entire executive team planning to attend along with Brad, myself, and 2 members of my marketing team. Everything went perfectly until the question and answer session. The client's female CEO asked a detailed question about our approach to targeting millennials through social media platforms, an area where I had particularly deep expertise and recent successful case studies. As I began to answer her question with specific data and strategic recommendations, Brad interrupted me to offer his own perspective, which was not only less informed than mine, but also included inappropriate comments about the appearance and behavior of young women that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. When I attempted to redirect the conversation back to professional topics and actual marketing strategy, Brad talked over me and suggested that my approach was too academic, and that successful marketing required understanding customers as real people with real desires. The sexual subtext was unmistakable, and the client's discomfort was obvious. The client's CEO ended the meeting abruptly, thanking us for our time but making it clear that they would be exploring other options for their marketing needs. As they were leaving, she pulled me aside to express her disappointment that Tech Forward's leadership approach didn't seem to align with their company's values around professional conduct and workplace respect. Losing that contract because of Brad's inappropriate behavior was devastating, not just financially but professionally. I had invested significant time and energy into developing a winning strategy, and seeing it undermined by conduct that had nothing to do with marketing expertise or strategic thinking felt like a betrayal of everything I had worked to build at Tech Forward. When I reported the incident to Mike, explaining how Brad's behavior had directly cost us a major client, his response was shocking. Instead of addressing Brad's conduct, he suggested that I had somehow failed to manage the client relationship effectively, and that my inability to work collaboratively with Brad was becoming a performance issue that needed to be addressed. That conversation made it clear that the company leadership was not going to take any meaningful action to address Brad's behavior, regardless of how much damage it caused to employee morale, client relationships, or company reputation. Mike had made a choice to protect his friend at the expense of everything else, and he was prepared to blame anyone who challenged that decision rather than acknowledge the problems it was creating. I left that meeting knowing that I had exhausted all internal options for addressing the situation through proper channels. Janet Kim had been effectively silenced, my formal complaints had been ignored, and Mike was actively retaliating against me for raising concerns about conduct that was clearly inappropriate and professionally damaging. The moment had come to make a decision that would define not only my own future but also my daughter's opinion of how women should respond when faced with workplace harassment and institutional betrayal. I could continue trying to navigate an increasingly hostile environment, hoping that things would somehow improve, or I could take action that might cost me my job but would also force the company to confront the consequences of enabling inappropriate behavior. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at the contact information for employment attorneys that I had quietly researched over the previous few weeks. Sofia was upstairs doing homework, unaware that her mother was contemplating a decision that could fundamentally change both of our lives. For 15 years, Tech Forward had been more than just my workplace. It had been the foundation of my professional identity, the source of financial security that allowed me to provide for my daughter, and the place where I had proven that hard work and expertise could overcome any obstacle. Walking away from that investment felt like abandoning everything I had built, but staying would mean accepting that women in the workplace could be subjected to harassment without recourse, that professional excellence was less important than personal loyalty to problematic leadership, and that speaking up about inappropriate conduct was a career-limiting choice rather than a professional responsibility. The decision I made that night would set in motion a series of events that would ultimately transform not only my own life, but also the lives of every woman who had been silenced, dismissed, or retaliated against for refusing to accept unacceptable behavior as the price of professional success. The morning I called David Chen's law office, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. I had found David through a referral from Patricia Williams, my former mentor who had left Tech Forward 3 years earlier to start her own consulting practice. Patricia had warned me that taking legal action against an employer was never simple, especially in Texas where employment laws favored businesses over workers, but she had also emphasized that documenting workplace harassment was essential for protecting other women who might face similar situations. David's office was located in downtown Austin, in one of those converted historic buildings that housed small law practices specializing in employment disputes. The waiting room was modest but professional, with framed certificates on the walls and stacks of legal journals on the coffee table. When David emerged to greet me, I was surprised by how young he looked, probably no more than 35, with the kind of serious demeanor that suggested he took these cases personally rather than viewing them as routine business transactions. During our initial consultation, David listened carefully as I walked through 15 months of documented incidents, failed internal complaints, and increasingly obvious retaliation. He took detailed notes, asked probing questions about witnesses and evidence, and explained the legal landscape for harassment and retaliation claims in Texas. The picture he painted was sobering but not hopeless. Texas employment law made it difficult to prove hostile work environment claims, but the pattern of behavior I had documented, combined with the company's failure to respond appropriately to formal complaints, created a viable case for both harassment and retaliation. What David emphasized most strongly was the importance of building a comprehensive record that went beyond my individual experience. Harassment cases were strongest when they demonstrated systematic problems rather than isolated incidents, and retaliation claims required clear evidence that adverse employment actions were connected to protected activity like filing complaints about discrimination or harassment. Over the following weeks, David and I worked together to construct a detailed timeline that included not only my own experiences, but also the complaints and concerns that other employees had shared with me. We documented the changes in my job responsibilities, the exclusion from key meetings and decisions, and the pattern of assignments being redistributed to male colleagues, without explanation. We also gathered evidence about the company's failure to follow its own stated policies for investigating harassment complaints and addressing workplace conduct issues. The process of organizing this evidence was both empowering and exhausting. Every email, every meeting note, every witness statement represented another piece of proof that the problems at Tech Forward were real and systematic rather than imaginary or overblown. But reviewing the documentation also meant reliving months of frustration, humiliation, and professional sabotage that had taken a significant toll on my confidence and well-being. David filed the initial complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission on a Tuesday morning in late September. The EEOC complaint was a necessary first step before pursuing litigation, but it also meant that Tech Forward would be officially notified that I was taking legal action against the company. David warned me that this notification would likely trigger immediate retaliation, and that I should be prepared for my work situation to become significantly more difficult. He was absolutely right. Within 48 hours of the company receiving notice of the EEOC complaint, Mike called me into his office for what he described as a performance review conversation. Tony Russo was also present, along with Janet Kim, who looked deeply uncomfortable with whatever role she had been asked to play in the meeting. Mike's approach was both predictable and infuriating. He presented a folder filled with what he characterized as performance concerns that had supposedly been developing over several months. These included complaints about my attitude during team meetings, concerns about my ability to collaborate effectively with new leadership, and suggestions that my approach to client relationships was becoming outdated and ineffective. Every item in the folder was either fabricated, taken out of context, or based on incidents that were directly related to my refusal to enable Brad's inappropriate behavior. When I had questioned Brad's conduct during client meetings, that was characterized as resistance to collaborative decision-making. When I had declined to participate in after-hours socializing that made me uncomfortable, that became lack of team engagement. When I had insisted on maintaining professional boundaries during client entertainment events, that was described as inflexibility in adapting to evolving business practices. The most insulting element of the performance review was Mike's suggestion that my recent behavior indicated I was going through some kind of personal crisis that was affecting my professional judgment. He recommended that I consider taking a leave of absence to get the support I need, and suggested that the company's employee assistance program might help me work through whatever issues are causing these workplace conflicts. I listened to this charade with mounting anger, but I also recognized it for what it was: a carefully orchestrated attempt to create a paper trail that would justify my termination, while making it appear that I was fired for performance reasons, rather than retaliation for filing harassment complaints. Mike and Tony had clearly consulted with attorneys about how to protect the company from liability, and they were following a playbook designed to discredit my credibility and my professional competence. When Mike finished presenting his fabricated performance concerns, I responded calmly but firmly. I pointed out that my performance reviews had been consistently positive throughout my 15 years with the company, that my client satisfaction scores remained high, and that the revenue generated by my team continued to exceed targets despite the disruptions caused by Brad's behavior and the company's retaliation against me. I also made it clear that I understood exactly what was happening, and that I would not be intimidated into resigning or accepting responsibility for problems created by the company's failure to address harassment and maintain professional workplace standards. The meeting ended with Mike promising to take my feedback into consideration, while making it obvious that the performance improvement plan they were implementing was designed to set me up for termination. Leaving that meeting, I felt a complex mixture of rage and relief. I was furious about the injustice and dishonesty of what I had just experienced, but I was also grateful that the company's retaliation was so obvious and ham-handed that it would strengthen rather than weaken my legal case. David had prepared me for exactly this kind of response, and we had already discussed how to document and respond to retaliatory actions. The performance improvement plan that Mike implemented was a masterpiece of workplace harassment, disguised as legitimate management. I was required to attend weekly meetings with Tony Russo to discuss my attitude and collaboration challenges. I had to submit daily reports on my activities and interactions with colleagues. I was excluded from client meetings unless specifically requested by the client, and even then I was required to have a male colleague present to ensure appropriate professional conduct. Most insultingly, I was required to attend sensitivity training sessions focused on adapting to diverse leadership styles and managing resistance to organizational change. These sessions were conducted by an outside consultant who had clearly been briefed to treat me as a problem employee who needed to learn how to accept new workplace norms, rather than someone who had raised legitimate concerns about harassment and retaliation. But while the company was implementing its retaliatory performance management plan, David and I were building an increasingly strong legal case. Other employees began reaching out to me, both current and former tech-forward staff who had witnessed Brad's behavior or experienced similar treatment themselves. These conversations revealed that the problems I had identified were even more widespread and systematic than I had initially realized. Lisa Martinez, a former account coordinator who had left the company 6 months earlier, contacted me after hearing through Austin's professional network that I was taking legal action. Lisa had been one of Brad's first targets after he joined the company, and she had endured months of inappropriate comments, unwanted physical contact, and quid pro quo suggestions about advancement opportunity. When she had attempted to report Brad's behavior, she was told that she was misinterpreting friendly behavior, and that she needed to develop thicker skin for working in a competitive sales environment. Lisa had eventually resigned rather than continue dealing with the harassment, but she had carefully documented every incident and had saved text messages and emails that demonstrated the pattern of Brad's behavior. Her evidence was devastating, particularly a series of text messages where Brad made explicit sexual suggestions and threatened to make her work life very difficult if she didn't agree to meet him for drinks after work. Through Lisa, I was connected to 3 other former employees who had similar stories about Brad's conduct and the company's failure to address it appropriately. Each woman had ultimately left Tech Forward rather than continue fighting a system that protected harassers and punished victims, but together their experiences painted a picture of systematic harassment that the company leadership had knowledge of and chose to ignore. Current employees were more reluctant to come forward, understandably concerned about their job security and their ability to continue working in Austin's relatively small professional community. But several women did agree to provide anonymous statements about their experiences, and a few were willing to serve as witnesses if the case proceeded to litigation. Janet Kim was in a particularly difficult position. As HR manager, she had detailed knowledge of every complaint that had been filed and every decision that had been made about how to respond to those complaints. She also had access to internal communications between Mike, Tony, and Brad that would be crucial evidence for demonstrating that the company leadership was aware of the harassment and chose to enable it rather than address it. But Janet was also a single mother with 2 young children who depended on her tech-forward salary for basic living expenses. She couldn't afford to lose her job by cooperating with my legal case, but she also couldn't continue participating in a system that silenced harassment victims and protected perpetrators. David and I worked with Janet to find ways for her to preserve important documents and communications without directly violating her employment obligation. The investigation phase of building the legal case took several months, during which my work situation at Tech Forward became increasingly unbearable. The performance improvement plan was clearly designed to create conditions that would force me to resign, but I was determined not to give Mike and Tony the satisfaction of achieving their goal through harassment and retaliation. Every day felt like walking through a minefield. Brad continued his inappropriate behavior, but now he was even more brazen because he knew that complaining about it would be characterized as evidence of my attitude problems and resistance to collaboration. Male colleagues who had previously treated me with professional respect began adopting similar approaches, apparently believing that the company's tolerance for Brad's conduct signaled that professional boundaries were no longer important. Client relationships became increasingly difficult to maintain as I was systematically excluded from key communications and decision-making processes. Several longtime clients specifically requested to continue working with me, but they were told that I was transitioning to new responsibilities and that other team members would be taking over their account. Some clients pushed back against these changes, but the company was willing to risk losing business rather than allow me to maintain the professional relationships that demonstrated my competence and value. The psychological toll of this systematic professional sabotage was significant. I had spent 15 years building my reputation and expertise at Tech Forward, and watching it be deliberately dismantled for raising legitimate concerns about workplace harassment was devastating. There were days when I questioned whether pursuing legal action was worth the personal and professional cost, especially given the uncertain outcome of employment litigation in Texas. But every time I considered giving up, I would think about the other women who were still working at Tech Forward and the women who would be hired in the future. If I walked away without fighting, Mike and Tony would conclude that their retaliation strategy was effective and that they could silence any employee who challenged inappropriate behavior. Brad would continue harassing women with impunity, and the company culture would become even more toxic and discriminatory. Sofia was also a constant source of motivation during this difficult period. She was now in her senior year of high school, preparing for college applications, and beginning to think seriously about her own professional future. The idea that she might someday face similar workplace harassment and retaliation was unacceptable to me. He wanted her to grow up in a world where women who spoke up about inappropriate behavior were supported rather than punished, where professional competence mattered more than willingness to tolerate harassment, and where legal protections for workers actually meant something. The turning point in the legal case came when David obtained internal communications through the discovery process that revealed the extent to which Tech Forward's leadership had knowingly enabled Brad's harassment. Email exchanges between Mike and Tony showed that they had received detailed complaints about Brad's behavior from multiple employees, but had decided to ignore them because Brad was generating significant sales revenue, and because they believed the complaining employees were being overly sensitive. Most damaging was a text message exchange between Mike and Brad where Mike explicitly told Brad to be more careful about who might be listening rather than to stop the inappropriate behavior entirely. This communication demonstrated that Mike was aware that Brad's conduct was problematic but was more concerned about avoiding liability than protecting employees from harassment. The discovery process also revealed that Tech Forward had recently increased its employment practices liability insurance coverage, suggesting that the company leadership anticipated facing harassment and discrimination claims. Internal legal memos showed that the company's attorneys had advised implementing stronger harassment prevention policies, but Mike and Tony had decided that such policies would be too restrictive and might stifle the dynamic culture that drives our success. Armed with this evidence, David was able to build a compelling case that Tech Forward had not only failed to prevent and address harassment, but had actively enabled it by protecting perpetrators and retaliating against victims. The pattern was so clear and systematic that David believed we had a strong chance of prevailing at trial and potentially obtaining significant damages for both the harassment and the retaliation. But litigation was expensive and time-consuming, and there were no guarantees about the outcome even with strong evidence. David explained that employment cases were often difficult for juries to understand, particularly in conservative jurisdictions where there might be skepticism about harassment claims or sympathy for business owners facing what they perceived as frivolous lawsuits. As we prepared for what looked like a lengthy legal battle, I began thinking about my long-term professional future. Regardless of how the lawsuit was resolved, it was clear that my career at Tech Forward was over. Mike and Tony had made it impossible for me to continue working there effectively, and even if I somehow prevailed in the legal case, the working relationship was too damaged to repair. But 15 years of experience in digital marketing and strategic business development had given me valuable skills and extensive professional relationships throughout Austin's business community. Several former colleagues had already approached me about consulting opportunities or potential positions with other firms. The question was whether I wanted to find another corporate position where I might face similar challenges, or whether I should consider starting something of my own. The idea of starting my own firm was both terrifying and exhilarating. I had the expertise and the client relationships to build a successful marketing consultancy, but I also had significant financial obligations, including Sofia's upcoming college expenses and my own retirement plan. Starting a business would require substantial initial investment and would involve financial risk that I wasn't sure I could afford as a single mother, but the more I thought about it, the more attractive the idea became. Working for myself would mean never again having to tolerate harassment or compromise my professional standards to protect someone else's profit. It would mean being able to create the kind of workplace culture that I believed in, where competence mattered more than politics, and where professional respect was non-negotiable. Most importantly, it would mean proving that women who spoke up about harassment didn't have to choose between their principles and their professional success. If I could build a successful business while simultaneously fighting Tech Forward's harassment and retaliation, it would send a powerful message about the consequences of mistreating competent employees and the opportunities that companies miss when they prioritize protecting harassers over developing talent. The decision to start Catalyst Digital was made during a conversation with Sofia one evening in late November. She had been accepted to her first choice university with a partial scholarship, but we were still facing significant expenses for her education. I was explaining the financial implications of the ongoing legal case and the uncertainty about my future employment when she interrupted me with a question that changed everything. "Mom," she said, "why don't you just start your own company and show them how it's supposed to be done?" Her confidence in my abilities and her understanding of what the legal fight was really about made me realize that I had been thinking too small. The goal wasn't just to hold Tech Forward accountable for harassment and retaliation. The goal was to demonstrate that there was a better way to run a business, a way that valued competence over compliance, and that created opportunities for everyone to succeed based on their abilities, rather than their willingness to tolerate inappropriate behavior. That night I began drafting a business plan for Catalyst Digital, a marketing consultancy that would combine strategic expertise with operational integrity to help Austin businesses achieve sustainable growth. The plan was ambitious but realistic, based on client relationships I had developed over 15 years, and market opportunities that I understood better than anyone else in the local business community. Starting the company while simultaneously pursuing legal action against Tech Forward would be challenging, but it would also be the ultimate vindication of everything I had been fighting for. If I could build a successful business that treated employees with respect and delivered superior results for clients, it would prove that professional excellence and ethical behavior were not incompatible but were actually essential for long-term success. Launching Catalyst Digital while fighting a legal battle against my former employer required a level level of strategic thinking and emotional resilience that I hadn't known I possessed. Every morning felt like preparing for war on multiple fronts, balancing client development calls with attorney meetings, managing cash flow projections while reviewing deposition transcripts, and maintaining professional composure while my former colleagues spread rumors throughout Austin's business community about my instability and litigation addiction. The first few months were brutal. I was working out of my home office, trying to build a client base while Tech Forward actively interfered with my business development effort. Mike and Tony had launched a whisper campaign suggesting that I was unprofessional, litigious, and difficult to work with. They warned potential clients that hiring me would expose them to harassment lawsuits and workplace drama. Several promising business opportunities evaporated after prospective clients received friendly advice about the risks of working with someone who couldn't get along with her previous employer. But their sabotage efforts also revealed something crucial about Tech Forward's business model and client relationship. The more I learned about how Mike and Tony were approaching damage control, the more I understood that their success had always been built on personal relationships and market manipulation rather than genuine expertise or superior results. They were spending enormous time and energy trying to destroy my reputation because they knew that their competitive advantage disappeared the moment clients had access to better strategic thinking and more professional service delivery. Rebecca Martinez changed everything. Rebecca was a partner at a private equity firm that specialized in scaling small businesses in emerging markets. She had been watching Austin's digital marketing landscape for several years, looking for opportunities to invest in agencies that combined local market knowledge with sophisticated strategic capability. When she heard about my legal situation through mutual connections, she didn't see a liability, she saw an opportunity. Rebecca's approach to business was refreshingly direct. She cared about results, ethical practices, and long-term sustainability rather than politics or personal relationships. During our first meeting, she listened carefully as I explained both my legal situation and my vision for Catalyst Digital. Her questions were tough but fair, focusing on market analysis, competitive positioning, and financial projections rather than the workplace drama that had consumed so much of my energy over the previous year. What impressed Rebecca most was my client retention strategy and the depth of relationships I had built throughout Austin's business community over 15 years. She recognized that Tech Forward's attempts to damage my reputation were actually backfiring by making me a more attractive partner for clients who valued integrity and professional competence over insider networking and social connections. Rebecca's investment in Catalyst Digital was substantial enough to allow me to lease proper office space, hire experienced staff, and compete directly with Tech Forward for major contracts. But more importantly, her involvement sent a signal to Austin's business community that serious investors viewed me as a credible alternative to the established agencies that had dominated the market through relationships rather than results. The first major contract came from the Austin Convention Center, which was looking for a marketing partner to help promote the city's tourism industry during a challenging economic period. The RFP was exactly the kind of high-visibility, strategically complex project that would establish Catalyst Digital's reputation and demonstrate our capabilities to a broader audience. Tech Forward also bid on the contract, naturally. Mike and Tony submitted a proposal that relied heavily on their existing relationship with city officials and their track record of previous tourism campaigns. Their approach was safe, predictable, and expensive, reflecting the kind of thinking that had made them successful during Austin's rapid growth period, but that was becoming increasingly inadequate for more challenging market conditions. My proposal was different. Instead of focusing on past relationships and generic strategies, I developed a comprehensive analysis of tourism trends, competitive positioning, and market opportunities that addressed the specific challenges facing Austin's hospitality industry. The proposal included innovative digital strategies, measurable performance metrics, and cost-effective implementation plans that would deliver superior results at a lower total investment. More importantly, my proposal demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking and professional execution that had been missing from Tech Forward's work since Brad's arrival and Mike's increasing focus on protecting his inner circle rather than serving clients effectively. The contrast was stark enough that the selection committee had no difficulty choosing Catalyst Digital despite Tech Forward's longer history and established relationships. Winning the convention center contract was personally satisfying, but it also served a larger strategic purpose. The project gave me a platform to demonstrate that professional excellence and ethical business practices were not only compatible but actually essential for delivering superior results. Every aspect of the campaign was executed with meticulous attention to detail, transparent communication, and measurable outcomes that exceeded the client's expectations. The success of the convention center campaign attracted attention from other major clients who had grown frustrated with Tech Forward's declining performance and increasingly unprofessional approach to client relationship. Within 6 months of launching Catalyst Digital, I was managing campaigns for 3 of Austin's largest employers and had a waiting list of prospective clients who specifically requested to work with my team. Meanwhile, Tech Forward was experiencing exactly the kind of operational problems that I had predicted would result from their toxic workplace culture and leadership dysfunction. Several key employees had resigned after experiencing or witnessing harassment, taking valuable client relationships and institutional knowledge with them. Brad's behavior had become so notorious within Austin's professional community that some clients were specifically requesting that he not be involved in their projects. The legal case was also progressing in ways that were putting increasing pressure on Tech Forward's leadership. David's discovery efforts had uncovered a pattern of harassment and retaliation that extended far beyond my individual experience, involving multiple employees over several years, and demonstrating systematic failure by company leadership to address known problems. The evidence was so compelling that Tech Forward's insurance company was pressuring Mike and Tony to consider settlement rather than risk a trial that could result in significant damages and extensive negative publicity. But the most devastating blow to Tech Forward came when Janet Kim finally decided to leave the company and provide testimony about the internal decision-making that had enabled Brad's harassment and retaliated against victims. Janet had carefully documented every complaint, every management decision, and every instance where she had been instructed to ignore or dismiss legitimate concerns about workplace conduct. Janet's testimony revealed that Mike and Tony had not only known about Brad's behavior but had actively discussed strategies for protecting him from consequences while discrediting his victim. Internal communications showed that they had viewed harassment complaints as public relations problems rather than serious workplace issues, and that they had been more concerned about potential legal liability than about the safety and dignity of their employees. The combination of Janet's insider testimony, the documented pattern of harassment affecting multiple employees, and the clear evidence of retaliation against me for filing complaints created an overwhelming legal case that Tech Forward's attorneys advised them they could not win at trial. The company's insurance company threatened to withdraw coverage if they didn't settle, and several major clients began reconsidering their contracts due to the negative publicity surrounding the harassment allegation. By the spring of my second year running Catalyst Digital, Tech Forward was in serious financial trouble. They had lost several major clients, faced mounting legal expenses, and were struggling to maintain operational stability with a depleted workforce and damaged reputation. Mike and Tony were spending more time managing crisis communications than developing business strategy, and their attempts to rebuild their client base were hampered by the widespread knowledge of their harassment and retaliation problem. The settlement offer that David negotiated on my behalf was substantial, reflecting both the strength of our legal case and Tech Forward's desperate need to resolve the litigation before it destroyed what remained of their business. But the monetary settlement was only part of what I had achieved. The real victory was demonstrating that women who spoke up about harassment could not only survive retaliation but could actually build something better than what they had lost. Catalyst Digital was generating more revenue in its second year than I had ever earned as an employee at Tech Forward. More importantly, we were delivering superior results for clients while maintaining the kind of professional workplace culture that treated every employee with dignity and respect. The contrast between our success and Tech Forward's decline was so obvious that it had become a case study in Austin's business community about the long-term costs of tolerating harassment and the competitive advantages of ethical leadership. But my ultimate goal was never just personal success or even holding Tech Forward accountable for their misconduct. I wanted to create lasting change that would benefit other women facing similar situations and demonstrate that professional excellence and ethical behavior were not competing priorities, but complementary strengths that could drive sustainable business success. The opportunity to achieve that larger goal came when Tech Forward's financial situation became so desperate that Mike and Tony began exploring options for selling the company or merging with a larger firm. Their business was failing, not just because of the legal expenses and reputation damage from the harassment scandal, but because their fundamental approach to client service and employee management was no longer viable in Austin's increasingly competitive and sophisticated market. Rebecca Martinez was the first person to suggest that Catalyst Digital should consider acquiring Tech Forward's remaining assets and client contracts. The idea seemed audacious at first, but the strategic logic was compelling. Tech Forward still had some valuable client relationships and operational infrastructure that could be integrated into Catalyst Digital's more professional and effective service model. More importantly, acquiring Tech Forward would send an unmistakable message about the consequences of enabling harassment and the opportunities available to leaders who prioritized competence and integrity. The acquisition negotiations were complex and emotionally charged. Mike and Tony were desperate to avoid bankruptcy but were also humiliated by the prospect of selling their company to someone they had tried to destroy through retaliation and reputation sabotage. They attempted to impose conditions that would have allowed them to maintain some control over operations, or that would have prevented me from making the personnel changes necessary to address the cultural problems that had caused Tech Forward's decline. But their negotiating position was fatally weakened by their legal and financial problems. They needed the acquisition to proceed more than I needed to complete it, and Rebecca's financial backing gave me the resources to structure a deal that met my requirements for operational control and cultural transformation. The final agreement gave me complete authority to restructure Tech Forward's operations, implement new policies and procedures, and make whatever personnel changes were necessary to integrate the two companies successfully. The day I walked back into Tech Forward's offices as the new owner was surreal. The same conference room where Brad had made inappropriate comments during client meetings was now mine to transform into a professional meeting space. The break room where Mike and Tony had celebrated their ability to silence harassment complaints would now operate according to policies that prioritized employee dignity and mutual respect. The office where I had been subjected to a sham performance review designed to justify retaliation would now be used to develop strategies for helping employees reach their full potential. But the most satisfying moment came when I had the opportunity to address the remaining Tech Forward employees about the changes that would be implemented under new ownership. Many of the women who had witnessed or experienced harassment were still working there, afraid to leave because of economic necessity or concern about their professional reputation. Several men who had been uncomfortable with the toxic culture but had felt powerless to change it were eager to contribute to a more professional environment. My message to the staff was simple and direct. We would be implementing new policies and procedures that prioritized professional competence, mutual respect, and ethical business practices. Everyone would be evaluated based on their ability to contribute to client success and team effectiveness, rather than their willingness to tolerate or enable inappropriate behavior. The company culture that had protected harassers and punished victims was ending permanently, and anyone who couldn't adapt to professional standards would be helped to find other opportunities more suited to their preferences. Brad Collins was terminated on my first day as owner. His dismissal was based on documented performance problems, client complaints, and violations of workplace conduct policies that would have justified termination regardless of the harassment allegation. But everyone understood the symbolic significance of his removal and the message it sent about the new expectations for professional behavior. Mike Thompson was more complicated. As the former owner, he had negotiated a consulting agreement that allowed him to maintain some involvement in strategic planning for a transitional period. But his role was carefully circumscribed, and it was clear that his influence over day-to-day operations was ending. The man who had once told me that I was getting older and didn't have the stamina anymore was now working for someone he had tried to force into early retirement through harassment and retaliation. The integration of Tech Forward's remaining assets into Catalyst Digital's operations took several months, but the results exceeded even my optimistic projection. Many of Tech Forward's former clients were eager to work with a more professional and competent team, and several had been quietly hoping for exactly this kind of change in ownership and management. The combined company was able to offer a broader range of services, while maintaining the high standards and ethical practices that had distinguished Catalyst Digital from its competitors. Sofia graduated from high school that spring and was preparing to start college in the fall with a full scholarship that would cover most of her expenses. She had watched my transition from harassment victim to business owner with a combination of pride and amazement, and she frequently told her friends that her mother had taught her never to accept mistreatment from employers or anyone else who tried to use power inappropriately. The financial success of the acquisition allowed me to establish a scholarship fund for young women pursuing degrees in business or marketing, with a specific focus on first-generation college students who faced economic barriers to higher education. The fund was designed to support women who demonstrated both academic excellence and leadership potential, giving them opportunities to build the skills and confidence necessary to challenge workplace discrimination when they encountered it in their own career. But the most meaningful outcome of the entire experience was the transformation of what had once been tech-forward's toxic workplace culture into an environment where professional competence was valued above personal connections, where employee concerns were addressed promptly and fairly, and where harassment of any kind was neither tolerated nor enabled by leadership. The new company culture attracted talented employees who had been frustrated by the limited opportunities available at firms that prioritized politics over performance. Several of Tech Forward's best former employees returned after hearing about the changes in ownership and management. The combination of experienced staff and fresh talent created exactly the kind of collaborative, high-performance environment that I had always believed was possible when people were treated with dignity and given opportunities to succeed based on their ability. 2 years after the acquisition, the integrated company was generating more revenue and serving more clients than Tech Forward had ever achieved during its peak years under Mike's leadership. But more importantly, employee satisfaction surveys consistently showed high levels of engagement, professional development, and workplace respect that demonstrated the business advantages of ethical leadership and inclusive management practices. The legal settlement with Tech Forward was finalized around the same time that the business integration was complete. The monetary award was substantial enough to provide financial security for Sofia's education and my own retirement planning, but the real value was the precedent it established for other women facing similar situations. David Chen used the case as a model for subsequent harassment and retaliation claims, and several other employment attorneys began citing our success as evidence that victims could achieve both legal vindication and professional triumph. Mike Thompson's consulting agreement expired after 18 months, and he chose not to seek renewal. The last time I saw him was during a client meeting, where he was required to present the transition plan for accounts that would be moving to direct management by my team. His presentation was professional but subdued, lacking the confident arrogance that had once characterized his approach to business relationships. After the meeting, he approached me privately to say that he had learned important lessons about leadership and workplace culture from watching how I had rebuilt what had once been his company. He acknowledged that his decisions regarding Brad's behavior had been wrong, and that his retaliation against me had been both unjust and counterproductive. The apology felt genuine, though it came too late to repair the damage he had caused to multiple employees and to his own business. Brad Collins left Austin entirely after his termination, relocating to a different city where his reputation as a harassment liability was less well known. I occasionally heard reports about his subsequent employment difficulties, as word about his conduct had spread throughout the professional networks that connected marketing and sales professionals across Texas. The consequences of his behavior and Tech Forward's enabling leadership followed him to each new position, making it increasingly difficult for him to find employers willing to take the risk of hiring someone with his documented history. The success of Catalyst Digital became a case study that Rebecca Martinez shared with other private equity investors, demonstrating the business advantages of supporting women entrepreneurs who had faced workplace discrimination. Rebecca used our partnership as a model for subsequent investments in companies founded by people who had been underestimated or mistreated by traditional corporate structures, but who had the skills and determination to build superior alternatives. 3 years after taking ownership of what had once been tech-forward, I was invited to speak at a conference for women business leaders about strategies for overcoming workplace harassment and building successful enterprises based on professional excellence and ethical practices. The audience included both aspiring entrepreneurs and established executives who had faced similar challenges in their own career. During the question and answer session, a young woman asked how I had maintained the motivation to fight back against retaliation and build something new rather than simply finding another corporate position where I might face similar problems. My answer focused on the importance of understanding that individual success was not enough, that lasting change required demonstrating alternative approaches that could serve as models for other women and other companies. But the real answer was simpler and more personal. I had fought back because accepting mistreatment would have taught my daughter that women who spoke up about harassment should expect to be punished for their courage, and that professional competence was less important than willingness to tolerate inappropriate behavior. I had built Catalyst Digital because I wanted Sofia to grow up in a world where women could achieve success without compromising their dignity, where professional excellence was valued above personal connection, and where speaking truth to power was recognized as a leadership strength rather than a career limitation. The evening after that conference presentation, I sat in my office looking out at the Austin skyline and reflecting on how much had changed since that first day when I had walked into tech forward 15 years earlier as a single mother hoping to build a stable career in a growing industry. The woman who had once felt grateful just to have a job with benefits and advancement potential had become someone who owned a successful company, employed dozens of people, and had created a workplace culture that other organizations used as a model for professional excellence and ethical leadership. Sofia was thriving in college, studying business and international relations with plans to work in sustainable development after graduation. She had inherited my strategic thinking abilities and my determination to create positive change. But she had also developed a confidence and sense of possibility that came from growing up with a mother who had demonstrated that women could overcome any obstacle through competence, courage, and strategic thinking. The scholarship fund that I had established was supporting 12 young women each year, providing them with both financial assistance and mentorship opportunities that would help them navigate their own career challenges. Several of the scholarship recipients had already completed internships at Catalyst Digital, learning about professional leadership in an environment that valued their potential and treated them with the respect that every worker deserved. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Brad Collins and Mike Thompson had actually done me a favor by revealing their true character and forcing me to choose between accepting mistreatment and fighting for something better. Their harassment and retaliation had been intended to silence me and force me out of the industry, but instead it had motivated me to build something superior to what they had created and to demonstrate that ethical leadership was not just morally right but also competitively advantageous. The company that had once fired me for speaking up about harassment was now thriving under my ownership, serving clients more effectively, treating employees more fairly, and generating more profit than it had ever achieved under the leadership of men who had prioritized protecting harassers over building sustainable success. The ultimate irony was that Mike and Tony's attempts to destroy my career had actually provided me with the motivation and opportunity to exceed any success I could have achieved as their employee. But the most important outcome was the message that our success sent to other women facing similar situations. Professional competence combined with ethical courage could overcome any form of workplace discrimination. Women who spoke up about harassment didn't have to choose between their principles and their careers. Speaking truth to power was not a career-limiting choice, but an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of leadership that creates lasting value for everyone. The January morning when everything finally came crashing down started like any other day. I was reviewing quarterly projections at my kitchen table. Sofia was getting ready for her final semester of high school, and the familiar sounds of our morning routine provided a comforting backdrop to what I hoped would be a productive day ahead. I had no way of knowing that by evening my 15-year career at Tech Forward would be over and my entire professional future would be thrown into uncertainty. The call came from Janet Kim at 7:30 in the morning, which was unusual enough to make me immediately concerned. Janet never called employees at home unless there was a genuine emergency, and her voice carried a tension that I had never heard before. She asked if I could come in early for what she described as an urgent discussion about my employment status. When I pressed her for details, she became evasive, saying only that Mike and Tony needed to speak with me immediately and that I should bring any personal belongings I might want to take home. The request to bring personal belongings was ominous enough that I knew this wasn't going to be a routine performance review or project discussion. I had been expecting some kind of retaliation for the EOC complaint I had filed, but the timing surprised me. David Chen had warned me that companies often waited several months before taking action against harassment complainants, hoping that the delay would make it harder to prove that adverse employment actions were directly related to protected activity. I arrived at the Tech Forward offices 45 minutes later to find the building's security guard waiting to escort me directly to the conference room. This level of formality was unprecedented in my experience with the company, and it signaled that whatever was about to happen had been carefully planned and orchestrated. The security escort also meant that I wouldn't have an opportunity to speak privately with colleagues or to access my computer and files before the meeting began. Mike and Tony were already seated at the conference table when I entered, along with Janet and a woman I didn't recognize who introduced herself as an employment attorney representing the company. The presence of outside legal counsel confirmed that this was a termination meeting, and the formal setup suggested that Tech Forward was expecting this conversation to be scrutinized later as part of ongoing litigation. Mike's opening statement was delivered in the kind of monotone that suggested he had rehearsed it multiple times, probably with coaching from the attorney about how to minimize legal liability while achieving his goal of removing me from the company. He explained that Tech Forward had completed a comprehensive review of my recent performance and had concluded that my attitude and collaboration challenges had created an untenable situation that required immediate resolution. The performance review that Mike referenced was the same fabricated document that had been created in response to my EEOC complaint, filled with distorted interpretations of my refusal to enable Brad's inappropriate behavior and my insistence on maintaining professional boundaries during client interactions. But now these manufactured concerns were being presented as the basis for termination. Despite my 15 years of consistently positive performance evaluations and my track record of exceeding revenue targets, even during the period when I was being systematically excluded from key decisions and opportunities, Tony took over the presentation to discuss what he characterized as my ongoing resistance to organizational change and collaborative leadership. This was corporate speak for my refusal to accept Brad's harassment and my persistence in filing complaints about conduct that any reasonable person would recognize as inappropriate and unprofessional. Tony's language was carefully chosen to avoid any explicit reference to harassment or retaliation, but the connection between my complaints and the termination was obvious to everyone in the room. The most insulting part of the termination meeting was the company's attempt to frame my firing as a mutually beneficial decision that would allow me to pursue opportunities more aligned with my personal values and working style. Mike suggested that I would be happier in an environment where I didn't have to adapt to Tech Forward's dynamic and collaborative culture, implying that my objections to harassment and unprofessional conduct were evidence of incompatibility rather than legitimate workplace concern. The attorney presented me with a separation agreement that included a severance package contingent on my agreement not to disparage the company or to encourage other employees to leave Tech Forward for competing firms. The non-disparagement clause was clearly designed to prevent me from sharing information about Brad's harassment or the company's retaliation with potential employers, clients, or other members of Austin's professional community. Most significantly, the separation agreement included a provision that would have required me to withdraw my EEOC complaint and to agree not to pursue any legal action against Tech Forward related to my employment or termination. The company was essentially offering to pay me to abandon my harassment and retaliation claims, hoping that financial pressure would force me to prioritize short-term economic security over long-term justice and accountability. I listened to the entire presentation without interruption, taking notes and maintaining the kind of professional composure that had served me well throughout my career at Tech Forward. When Mike finished explaining the terms of the separation agreement, he asked if I had any questions or if I needed time to consider their offer. His tone suggested that he expected me to accept the terms gratefully and to disappear quietly from Austin's business community. My response was brief and direct. I thanked them for clarifying their position and confirmed that I understood exactly what they were proposing. I also made it clear that I would not be signing any agreement that required me to withdraw legitimate complaints about harassment or to remain silent about conduct that had created a hostile work environment for multiple employees. The separation meeting ended with Mike and Tony clearly frustrated by my refusal to accept their terms, but there was nothing they could do to force me to sign an agreement that would have undermined my legal right. The security escort that accompanied me to my office to collect personal belongings was both humiliating and revealing. I was given 15 minutes to gather personal items while being watched constantly to ensure that I didn't access confidential files or communicate with colleagues about my termination. The message was clear. Tech Forward viewed me as a security threat, whose departure needed to be managed carefully to prevent damage to their business operations. But the most telling moment came when I encountered Brad in the hallway during my supervised exit from the building. He was standing near the elevator with a satisfied smirk that made it obvious he had been waiting to witness my departure. When he saw me carrying a box of personal belongings, he made a comment about how troublemakers always get what they deserve, and suggested that I would have a difficult time finding another position in Austin, given my reputation for creating workplace conflict. Brad's gloating confirmed what I had suspected about his role in orchestrating my termination. He had clearly been pushing Mike and Tony to fire me as quickly as possible, probably arguing that my continued presence at Tech Forward posed a threat to his ability to conduct business as usual. His comment about my future employment prospects also revealed that he and the company leadership were planning to interfere with my job search efforts, spreading negative information about my performance problems and litigation history to potential employers. The drive home from Tech Forward that morning was surreal. After 15 years of commuting to the same building, following the same routine, and building my professional identity around my role at the company, I was suddenly unemployed and facing an uncertain future. The termination had happened so quickly that I hadn't had time to process the emotional impact of losing not just a job but a significant part of my professional identity and financial security. Sofia was already at school when I arrived home, which gave me time to call David Chen and report the termination before she heard the news from me. David's response was both reassuring and sobering. He confirmed that the timing and circumstances of my termination strengthened our retaliation case significantly, but he also warned that the legal process would likely take months or years to resolve, and that I needed to prepare for a prolonged battle with uncertain outcome. David's immediate advice was to document everything about the termination meeting, while the details were still fresh in my memory, to preserve any evidence I had collected during my employment, and to begin reaching out to potential witnesses who might be willing to testify about the harassment and retaliation I had experienced. He also recommended that I start looking for alternative employment immediately, both to mitigate financial damages and to demonstrate that I was making good faith efforts to rebuild my career despite Tech Forward's interference. The job search process revealed the extent to which Mike and Tony were actively sabotaging my employment prospects throughout Austin's business community. Several potential employers who had initially expressed interest in my background suddenly became unavailable for interviews after conducting reference checks with Tech Forward. Others asked pointed questions about my departure circumstances that suggested they had received negative information about my performance or professional conduct. The most frustrating aspect of Tech Forward's interference was that it was difficult to prove and almost impossible to counter effectively. Mike and Tony were too sophisticated to make obviously false statements about my work history, but they could raise concerns about my cultural fit or suggest that my collaborative style might not be appropriate for certain work environments. These coded messages were enough to make potential employers hesitant to hire someone who might bring workplace drama or legal complications to their organization. After 6 weeks of unsuccessful job applications and increasingly obvious interference from my former employer, I realized that I needed to fundamentally rethink my approach to rebuilding my career. The traditional path of finding another corporate position was being blocked by Tech Forward's retaliation efforts, and even if I eventually found an employer willing to hire me despite their sabotage, I would still be vulnerable to similar harassment and discrimination in any male-dominated workplace. The conversation with Patricia Williams that changed my perspective took place at a coffee shop in South Austin on a rainy Thursday afternoon in March. Patricia had been following my situation through mutual connections in Austin's business community, and she had reached out to offer both moral support and practical advice about navigating career transitions in a competitive market. Patricia's own experience leaving Tech Forward 3 years earlier had been different from mine, but she had also recognized that the company's culture was becoming increasingly toxic and unprofessional. Her decision to start her own consulting practice had been motivated by frustration with corporate politics and a desire to work with clients who valued strategic expertise over personal relationships. Her business had grown steadily by focusing on results and maintaining the kind of professional standards that were becoming increasingly rare in Austin's rapidly growing business environment. During our conversation, Patricia asked a question that forced me to think beyond the immediate challenge of finding another job. She pointed out that I had 15 years of experience developing marketing strategies for some of Austin's most successful businesses, along with deep relationships throughout the local professional community, and a track record of delivering results that exceeded client expectations. She wanted to know why I was limiting myself to looking for corporate positions when I had all the skills and connections necessary to build my own successful consulting practice. The idea of starting my own business had occurred to me during the previous weeks, but I had dismissed it as too risky, given my financial obligations and the uncertainty surrounding the legal case against Tech Forward. Patricia helped me understand that remaining dependent on corporate employers might actually be the riskier choice, especially given the demonstrated willingness of some business leaders to retaliate against employees who challenged inappropriate conduct. Patricia's success with her own consulting practice provided a concrete example of how former Tech Forward employees could build thriving businesses by offering clients the kind of professional service and strategic expertise that had become increasingly rare as the company's culture deteriorated. Her clients specifically valued her ability to deliver results without the drama and unprofessional conduct that had begun to characterize Tech Forward's approach to client relationships. More importantly, Patricia explained how starting my own business would fundamentally change the power dynamics that had made me vulnerable to harassment and retaliation at Tech Forward. As an independent consultant, I would have the authority to choose my clients, set my own professional standards, and refuse to work with anyone who didn't treat me with appropriate respect. I would never again have to choose between tolerating inappropriate behavior and risking my financial security. The business plan for Catalyst Digital began to take shape during that conversation with Patricia and evolved over the following weeks as I researched market opportunities, analyzed competitive positioning, and developed financial projections. The plan was ambitious but realistic, based on client relationships I had developed over 15 years and market knowledge that few other marketing professionals in Austin could match. The name Catalyst Digital reflected my vision of a consulting practice that would help clients achieve transformational growth through strategic marketing and business development services. But it also represented my personal commitment to catalyzing change in Austin's business community by demonstrating that professional excellence and ethical conduct were not competing priorities but complementary strengths that could drive sustainable success. The initial client acquisition strategy focused on businesses that had worked with Tech Forward in the past and had become frustrated with the declining quality of service and increasing unprofessional conduct. Several former clients had already reached out to me directly after learning about my departure from the company, expressing interest in continuing to work with me in an independent capacity. These initial conversations revealed that Tech Forward's problems were even more extensive than I had realized. Multiple clients reported experiencing inappropriate conduct from Brad during business meetings and company events, along with declining strategic capabilities and increasing focus on social relationships rather than measurable results. Several had already begun exploring alternative marketing partners, and they were eager to work with someone who could provide superior service without the baggage of Tech Forward's dysfunctional culture. The legal case against Tech Forward was also progressing in ways that supported my decision to start an independent business rather than seek traditional employment. David's discovery efforts had uncovered extensive evidence of systematic harassment and retaliation that strengthened our position significantly, but the litigation process was likely to continue for months or years before reaching resolution. Starting my own business would allow me to rebuild my career and generate income while the legal case proceeded, rather than remaining dependent on uncertain employment prospects in a market where Tech Forward was actively interfering with my job search efforts. More importantly, building a successful independent practice would demonstrate that their retaliation had not achieved its intended goal of destroying my professional prospects. The first major client meeting for Catalyst Digital took place in April, just 3 months after my termination from Tech Forward. The prospective client was a technology startup that needed strategic marketing support for launching their first consumer product, and they had specifically requested to work with me, based on recommendations from mutual connections in Austin's entrepreneurial community. The meeting was held at their offices in East Austin, in one of the converted warehouses that had become popular with tech companies seeking affordable space and creative environment. The startup's leadership team was young, diverse, and refreshingly focused on building a sustainable business rather than playing corporate politics or maintaining traditional power structure. Their questions during the meeting focused on strategic capabilities, measurable outcomes, and collaborative approaches to problem solving rather than personal relationships or social connection. They wanted to understand how I would help them reach their target market, what metrics I would use to measure success, and how I would adapt strategies based on market feedback and changing competitive conditions. The presentation I delivered was the culmination of 15 years of experience developing marketing strategies for Austin businesses, combined with insights about emerging trends and best practices that I had gained through continuous professional development and industry engagement. But it was also informed by hard-earned wisdom about the importance of maintaining professional boundaries and creating work relationships based on mutual respect rather than personal entertainment or social networking. The startup's decision to hire Catalyst Digital was based entirely on professional criteria: my track record of delivering results for similar businesses, my understanding of their target market and competitive landscape, and my ability to develop creative strategies that aligned with their budget constraints and timeline requirements. The contrast with Tech Forward's relationship-based approach to client acquisition was stark and refreshing. The success of that first major project established Catalyst Digital's reputation in Austin's business community and generated referrals that allowed me to be selective about subsequent client relationships. Within 6 months of starting the business, I was working with 5 clients and had a waiting list of prospective projects that would provide financial stability for the foreseeable future. But the most satisfying aspect of building Catalyst Digital was the opportunity to create the kind of professional environment that I had always believed was possible when people were treated with dignity and respect. Every client relationship was built on clear expectations, transparent communication, and measurable outcomes rather than personal networking or social obligation. The legal resolution with Tech Forward came 18 months after my termination, when their insurance company finally pressured Mike and Tony to settle the case rather than risk a trial that could have resulted in devastating damages and extensive negative publicity. The settlement amount was substantial enough to provide financial security for Sofia's college education and my own retirement planning, but the real victory was the precedent it established for other women facing similar situations. David Chen used our case as a model for subsequent harassment and retaliation claims, demonstrating that victims could achieve both legal vindication and professional success when they refused to be silenced or intimidated by employer retaliation. The settlement also included provisions requiring Tech Forward to implement comprehensive harassment prevention training and to establish clear procedures for addressing workplace conduct complaints. But the ultimate vindication came 2 years later when Tech Forward's declining performance and damaged reputation created an opportunity for me to acquire their remaining assets and client contracts. The company that had once fired me for speaking up about harassment was now struggling to survive in a competitive market where professional competence and ethical conduct had become essential for sustainable success. The acquisition of Tech Forward by Catalyst Digital was more than just a business transaction. It was a demonstration that women who spoke up about harassment didn't have to choose between their principles and their professional success, that building something better was often more effective than seeking revenge, and that ethical leadership was not just morally right but also competitively advantageous in the long term. Walking back into the offices where I had once been escorted out by security, now as the owner rather than a terminated employee, was deeply satisfying on a personal level. But the real significance was the message it sent to other women facing similar challenges. Professional excellence combined with moral courage could overcome any form of workplace discrimination. The transformation of Tech Forward's toxic culture into Catalyst Digital's professional environment required significant changes in policies, procedures, and personnel. Brad Collins was terminated immediately, not just because of his harassment history but because his approach to client relationships and team management was fundamentally incompatible with the standards of professional conduct that would define the merged company's operation. Mike Thompson's role was gradually phased out over 18 months as it became clear that his leadership style and business priorities were no longer relevant in a market that increasingly valued competence over connection. His departure was handled professionally but firmly, with clear expectations that his influence over company culture and client relationships would end completely. The new company culture attracted talented employees who had been frustrated by limited opportunities at firms that prioritized politics over performance. Several of Tech Forward's best former employees returned after hearing about the changes in ownership and management, bringing valuable experience and client relationships that strengthened our competitive position significantly. Sofia's graduation from high school coincided with the first anniversary of Catalyst Digital's acquisition of Tech Forward, and her college plans were fully funded by the success of the business I had built after being fired for refusing to tolerate harassment. Her confidence in pursuing her own professional goals was strengthened by watching her mother demonstrate that speaking up about inappropriate conduct was not a career-limiting choice, but an opportunity to build something better. The scholarship fund I established for young women pursuing business and marketing careers was designed to provide both financial support and mentorship opportunities that would help them navigate their own workplace challenges. The fund specifically prioritized first-generation college students who demonstrated both academic excellence and leadership potential, giving them tools to challenge discrimination when they encountered it in their own career. 3 years after my termination from Tech Forward, I was invited to speak at a national conference about strategies for overcoming workplace harassment and building successful businesses based on professional excellence and ethical practice. The audience included both aspiring entrepreneurs and established executives who had faced similar challenges in their own careers. The questions from conference attendees revealed how widespread harassment and retaliation problems were throughout American workplaces, but also how hungry people were for examples of women who had successfully fought back and built alternative models of professional success. My story resonated particularly strongly with women who were struggling to decide whether to report inappropriate conduct or to simply try to manage difficult situations without risking their economic security. The most important message I shared with that audience was that individual success was not enough to create lasting change. Real progress required demonstrating that there were better ways to conduct business, ways that valued competence over compliance, and that created opportunities for everyone to succeed based on their abilities rather than their willingness to tolerate inappropriate behavior. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Brad Collins and Mike Thompson had actually provided me with an unexpected gift by revealing their true character and forcing me to choose between accepting mistreatment and fighting for something better. Their harassment and retaliation had been intended to silence me and drive me out of Austin's business community, but instead it had motivated me to build something superior to what they had created. The company that had once fired me for speaking up about harassment was now thriving under my ownership, serving clients more effectively, treating employees more fairly, and generating more profit than it had ever achieved under leadership that had prioritized protecting harassers over building sustainable success. The ultimate irony was that Mike and Tony's attempts to destroy my career had actually provided me with the motivation and opportunity to exceed any success I could have achieved as their employee. But the most meaningful outcome was the message that our success sent to other women facing similar situations. Professional competence, combined with ethical courage, could overcome any form of workplace discrimination. Women who spoke up about harassment didn't have to choose between their principles and their careers. Speaking truth to power was not a career-limiting choice, but an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of leadership that creates lasting value for everyone. The evening after that conference presentation, I sat in my office, looking out at the Austin skyline and reflecting on how much had changed since that January morning when I had been escorted out of Tech Forward with a box of personal belongings. The woman who had once felt devastated by losing a job she had thought was essential to her identity had become someone who owned a successful company, employed dozens of people, and had created a workplace culture that other organizations used as a model for professional excellence. Sofia was thriving in college, studying sustainable business practices and international development, with plans to create positive change on a global scale. She had inherited my strategic thinking abilities and my determination to challenge injustice, but she had also developed a confidence that came from growing up with a mother who had demonstrated that any obstacle could be overcome through competence, courage, and strategic persistence. The scholarship recipients were beginning to graduate and enter their own professional careers, carrying with them the tools and confidence necessary to navigate workplace challenges while maintaining their integrity and advancing their goals. Several had completed internships at Catalyst Digital, learning about ethical leadership in an environment that valued their potential and treated them with the respect that every worker deserved. The business itself continued to grow and evolve, attracting clients who valued professional excellence and employees who wanted to work in an environment where competence was recognized and inappropriate conduct was neither tolerated nor enabled. We had become a model for other Austin businesses about the competitive advantages of ethical leadership and inclusive management practices. But perhaps the most important outcome was the demonstration that women who faced workplace harassment and retaliation could not only survive but could actually use those experiences as motivation to build something better than what they had lost. Speaking up about inappropriate conduct was not a guarantee of easy success, but it was an essential step toward creating workplaces where everyone could thrive based on their abilities rather than their willingness to accept mistreatment. The legal precedent established by our successful harassment and retaliation case had been cited in dozens of subsequent employment law decisions, helping other victims achieve justice and encouraging employers to take workplace conduct issues more seriously. The business model we had created was being studied by management consultants and business schools as an example of how ethical leadership could drive superior financial performance. Most importantly, the example we had set was inspiring other women to speak up about inappropriate conduct and to pursue their professional goals without compromising their dignity or accepting mistreatment as the price of career advancement. The message was simple but powerful. Excellence and integrity were not competing priorities, but complementary strengths that could overcome any obstacle and create opportunities for sustainable success. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.